welcome to stage 1.2 of European Journeys. This is the second stage of this journey that leads us into the footsteps of Paul. Last week we were near Rome, but today we are going in the very south of Italy, into the island of Sicily. And we are actually going in the very south of that island, the southeastern coast, to the city of Siracusa, or Syracuse in English. Well, the old city lies on an island that is just off the shores of Sicily, and that island is called Ortigia. And the island today is connected to the mainland with two bridges, so we can walk there. The 19th century Roman Catholic historian Giuseppe Maria Capodieci wrote about the history of the city of Syracuse. And he said that there was a tribe known as the Etoli, who came here for the first time 320 years after the flood during the time of Noah. And so that first tribe reached Ortigia. And the year that the historian mentioned is the year 2028 before Christ. Then, more than a millennium later, Greek colonists coming from the city of Corinth took control of the small island of Ortigia and established what became the city of Syracuse, and that was in 758 BC. And today we find numerous ruins of Greek temples still in the city, and these are of course testimonies of half of a millennium of Greek presence in Siracusa. Well, this half of a millennium of Greek presence ended in 212 BC. And that is when the Roman consul Marcus Marcellus took control of this last part of Sicily that the Romans had not yet invaded. So really Siracusa was the last rump of resistance against the Roman invasion. Even though his time in Syracuse was brief, there are several landmarks that recall Paul's passage in the city of Syracuse. The most famous of them is a statue that is in front of the cathedral of Siracusa. But the location we are going to visit today is a smaller church, which is located at only 500 meters north from the cathedral. That church is also dedicated to Paul. It is called Chiesa San Paolo Apostolo, which simply means St. Paul Apostle's Church. And like many other buildings in Ortigia, the church building we see here is a church building that is dating back to the 18th century. And the reason for that is that there had been a huge earthquake that had devastated the city in 1693. So the architectural style of the church is actually the Baroque style of the 18th century. In the Bible, the book of the Acts of the Apostles, which is the only record available of Paul's journey in Italy, don't tell much about what the apostle did here in Syracuse. The author, Luke, who was also Paul's co-traveler, wrote the following sentence, and I quote, "After 3 months we departed," that is from Malta, "in a ship of Alexandria, which had winter in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. And landing at Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days." End quote. So of course, even though there is no record of what they did in Syracuse, in history there has been much speculations about what they did. For example, there is a local legend that says that while Paul was preaching in a cave north of the city, a man who was listening was stung by a scorpion. And as the crowd gathered in the cave, was certain that the man would soon die, while Paul shouted to him, "Don't be afraid, have faith in God, because this is only the bite of a crab." And lo and behold, a while later, Paul picked up the animal, and it was indeed a crab. Well, of course, such a story of an animal transformed into another animal does not seem to come from a Christian background, but rather from a pagan background. Because indeed, in paganism, evolutionistic stories of the kind were not uncommon and are not uncommon today either. Paul had experienced God's protection with the bite of an animal. It was not a scorpion, but it was a snake, and that had happened in Malta just a few weeks earlier, a few weeks prior to arriving here in Syracuse. So this was indeed the accomplishment of Jesus' promise that no serpent or scorpion will hurt you, as he said to his disciples. So if the local legend doesn't seem to be much reliable, What could we find here that can possibly help us imagine what Paul could have done in Syracuse? Well, again, this is just speculation, but if we look in front of St. Paul Apostle's Church, there we find an ancient Greek temple which had been built in honor of the god Apollo. And even though the city was not anymore under Greek rule, as I told you, nevertheless, the temple of Apollo was still one of the most important buildings of Syracuse at the time. And in Greek mythology, we learn that Apollo was known to be the son of Zeus, the most powerful god. The Greeks identified him as the god who punished evil, who afforded help, and protected from evil. And he was also known to be the god of song and music, the god who protected the flock and the cattle, and the god who delighted in the foundations of towns and the establishment of civil constitutions. Well, what would Paul have done with that? We know that Paul preached to pagan crowds. He was used to preach to people that believed in the gods, in the Greek gods. And we can imagine that here in Syracuse, if he had preached, he would have introduced the God, the Trinitarian God that is a true God, also by using the attributes that were given to the false God, that God named Apollo. So Paul could have said that as creator of all things, God was thus the creator also of music and animals, those very things that were under the control of Apollo according to Greek mythology, that were believed to be under his control. And so, since he was the creator of those things, he had also sovereignty over those things. He had sovereign control over those things. And regarding evil that was believed Apollo would punish, Paul could have said that actually God punished the root of all evils, and that is sin, in his Son Jesus Christ, who had died at the cross and rose again some 30 years earlier before the coming of Paul here in Syracuse. And so now, instead of deserving eternal separation from God, humans could receive forgiveness through faith in his Son and being adopted into God's family as his children. Finally, while Apollo was said to delight in the foundation of towns and the establishment of civil constitutions, well, Paul could have announced that God's kingdom of perfect peace was now coming as the heavenly Jerusalem on earth and was on its way to cover the entire world. Well, of course, since there is no more reliable records than the short sentence which we find in the book of Acts, in the records that Luke wrote in the Bible, all of this is just pure speculation. And it is even possible that Paul simply rested near the harbor during the few days of stopover here. But nevertheless, if Paul had had the opportunity to preach the gospel in Syracuse, this would have been the sort of message that he would have preached in such a pagan city. Well, today the kingdom of God doesn't cover the whole earth yet, obviously. But here in Syracuse, we find a temple, a pagan temple, which is now in ruins. And right next to it, we have a church building that recalls Paul's visit here. It's a church that is in honor of the Apostle Paul. And this is one of the countless symbols of the transformation that Europe has undergone through the spread of the gospel over the past 2,000 years. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.